Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and this week we are continuing a series that we started 3 weeks ago on the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. In the last program, we discussed a profound and, in many ways, prophetic book Lewis wrote entitled The Abolition of Man. And in today's program and next week's program, we are going to discuss one of Lewis's most influential writings in the realm of theology, and it's called Mere Christianity. And to help us understand this book better is a colleague of mine here at Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Timothy Yoder. Dr. Yoder is an associate professor of theological studies here at Dallas Theological Seminary. He teaches courses on theology, philosophy, logic, and apologetics. He also has taught courses on the philosophy of C.S. Lewis. Dr. Yoder holds a Bachelor of Science from Cairn University, a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and a Master of Arts from Marquette University, and a Ph.D. also from Marquette University. Dr. Yoder, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Well, thank you, Dr. Weaver. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to continue our conversations about Lewis. I think Mere Christianity is one of the great Christian books of the 20th century and one of the great apologetic books as well.
The book that we are discussing today, written by C.S. Lewis, is Mere Christianity. As I already mentioned, it may be Lewis's most well-known and influential theological book. Many have regarded it as one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Dr. Yoder, please explain to our audience how the book Mere Christianity came into being.
Well, it's a great story, actually. Lewis, as we talked about before, became an adult convert to Christianity in his 30s. He was a fellow at Oxford University with a specialization in literature, and he wanted to write, to publish, to speak, but he was still relatively unknown. He had written a book called The Problem of Pain, which caught the attention of a few people. As World War II was breaking out, some individuals at the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, thought what England needed was someone to come on their show and do a series of religious talks to boost the morale of the country. It's a very striking kind of conclusion by a national or public broadcasting company. It's hard to imagine somebody doing something exactly like that today, although I think we could use it. But then who? Who would they ask? And they didn't necessarily want somebody who was a clergy and associated with a particular church. They looked around and they landed on Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis. And it turns out it was a perfect choice. These were brilliant broadcasts. He came on and broadcast a series of talks, one about every 9 months or a year in the early 40s, which were then published as a series of pamphlets, and finally kind of put together and slightly revised and published in the early 50s as Mere Christianity. The radio broadcasts were really well done. He wrote them all out. His manner and delivery was very well suited for the radio, and he quickly won a large following. His first one was broadcast on Wednesday evening, August 6, 1941 at 7:45 in the evening, and he was relatively unknown. But his style, his content was very striking, lots of great analogies and illustrations, very accessible, and quickly people across the country began to tune in and listen, and people have been tuning in for something like 80 years now.
So it's a very dark period of time in history, certainly in Britain, the bombing of the city and all of that.
It's actually a really interesting display of the title of this podcast, Theology Matters, right? Bible and theology matter because it was what the people needed. What they needed was some good, hard, thoughtful talk on the matters of real importance, our human nature, God, morality, and ultimately faith.
And Lewis, being a military man himself, having been a soldier during World War I, he certainly have a good pulse for people and people in the war itself.
Yeah, he really was. He was an academic. He was a good academic, and he wrote excellent works in his specialty, which is literature. but he also had a real knack for connecting with the everyday person. And Lewis worked hard at that, and it shows in his books. Now, it's worth noting that Mere Christianity broadcasted and published long before the Narnia Chronicles came into existence. I think a lot of people just assume that Lewis became famous writing those books and then everything else followed. In fact, the Narnia Chronicles, one of the last things that he wrote. Many of his other books, like Problem of Pain and Screwtape and Mere Christianity and Miracles and The Great Divorce, all came prior to that. So Lewis worked hard to be a good communicator on lots of levels to lots of different kind of people.
What is meant by the title Mere Christianity?
It's not a phrase that's original with Lewis. It comes actually from an old British author by the name of Richard Baxter, a clergyman and theologian who wrote in the 1600s. It captured really well what Lewis intended, which was that he wanted to focus in on those beliefs, positions, doctrines that all traditions, all Christian traditions and denominations could affirm. So he wasn't interested in delving into controversial issues like the doctrine of election or ecclesiological issues, different denominations and denominational fights, eschatology and other sorts of things. He didn't necessarily even get very deep into what we would call soteriology and theories of atonement and other sorts of things. But he was interested in the basic, the common elements of Christianity. What Thomas Oden calls classic Christianity isn't too far from what we're talking about here, what all Christians hold. Now, that's probably a little bit of an idealistic statement. We as Christians are quite diverse, been around for 2,000 plus years, and lots of traditions, lots of denominations, and not everybody that identifies himself as a Christian is going to believe in all the same sorts of things. But Lewis did. He focused on God, of course, the existence of God, the Trinity, the Incarnation. He focused on our human nature. He focused on faith. He focused on ethics. And so it's a work of apologetics. It's to try to get people to believe and take the first steps to kind of ground a good foundation, and then to move on to the weightier or the more difficult and controversial issues.
And of course, that's why he's of special interest to you as an apologist.
Absolutely. Well, we're all apologists at some level,
right.
just like we're all theologians. I think we all are called to defend the faith. We're all called to be able to give an account when people ask. We're all called by our example to display Christian truths. And again, Lewis, he didn't have theological training. In that sense, he liked to refer to himself as a layperson, is a good example.
And it's interesting that even in the introduction, Lewis brings up the subject of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Lewis was also a close friend to, and we talked about this in earlier podcast, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a devout Catholic, who influenced Lewis to believe in God and believe in Jesus. And Lewis has been criticized for being too ecumenical, trying to bring Catholics and Protestants together in this book and in this radio addresses. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's always difficult, when you're writing for a broad audience. And as a Christian, you want to do more than just address the Baptists or more than just address the Presbyterians. He wasn't a Protestant. He was an Anglican. An Anglican is a very interesting movement in Christian tradition. It's kind of halfway between Catholic and Protestant. And of course, it emerged as part of the Protestant Reformation with Henry VIII.
Not over doctrine so much, right?
Well, that's true. That's another interesting story, right? That's a good topic for another podcast, right? He's not an evangelical like we think of the word evangelical. It's fairly high church. And he holds some beliefs that maybe some evangelicals would be a little uncomfortable with. I think we're going to get to some of those. Being Anglican, he's sort of in a little bit of a middle ground. So I wanted to read a little bit of what he said in the introduction about this question. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to be an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or Roman Catholic. There is no mystery about my own position. I'm a very ordinary layman in the Church of England, not especially high or especially low or especially anything else. But in this book, I'm not trying to convert anyone to my own position. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I can do for my unbelieving neighbors is to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. And I think that's a solid and important calling. I think that's really significant. We could talk about the biblical text that says to be all things to all people and to contextualize the gospel in different sorts of ways. And in a sense, that's what Lewis is doing. He's not ignoring the other traditions, but he's trying to find some middle ground between them for the sake of the gospel.
Well, in chapter 1, Lewis discusses the law of human nature, as he calls it. Would you explain what he means by the law of human nature?
Lewis, in his effort not to be too academic, sometimes he invents his own words for things, and sometimes that's probably a little misleading. The law of human nature is really what people usually call the natural law, the idea that there is, in the universe, is written into the way things are, a moral code. I love Lewis's argument right at the beginning. It's a great discussion. He says, you've all heard people quarreling, and we know what that sounds, and sometimes it sounds kind of funny, and sometimes it's disturbing or uncomfortable. But when they quarrel, they are acknowledging that there is a right and a wrong. Whether it's a quarrel in a sporting event or a quarrel over an ethical question or a quarrel in politics, there's a right. There is a right. He says it's not just fighting to see who's the strongest, but you're arguing with a view towards what is correct. That notion that there are some things that are correct is a very key point in what we call the natural law. That morals and ethics are not just something that we've made up, but rather there is a right and wrong. We don't say that Newton invented the laws of gravity. No, he discovered them. It's the same way we wouldn't say that we have invented ethics, but rather we discover them. And that's the natural law idea.
Everybody has said at some point in time, that's not fair.
Exactly. This notion that we all have of fairness is a really important indicator of that. You don't have to teach somebody fairness, even little kids. Pass out cookies and give one kid more cookies than the other, and that's not fair, right? And how do they know that? It's innate. It's part of the way we are made. That's an indicator, again, of this notion of the natural law.
Just one year I taught a course on a few of the writings of C.S. Lewis, and I was trying to think of examples of this, and I was talking to my wife, and one she mentioned was, it's not fair that just because someone's addicted to nicotine that they get smoke breaks and I don't. Like, that was one that she struggled with as a teenager.
That bothers us. We are wired to detect injustices, whether they're relatively small things or important things. And that fairness is innate within us. It flows from our conscience.
How does Lewis respond to the objection raised that various nations had different moral teachings?
I think that one of the ways that we could respond, and I think Lewis would agree with that, is to say, well, yes, there are some differences, but if we could quantify or catalog all of the ethical practices and really compare them, we would discover that there is much, much more agreement across countries and cultures than there is disagreement. And the things that we agree on are central to what it means to be human and to have a human society. Things like telling the truth. Things like respecting property, things like obeying your parents, things like not killing and not stealing, and the significance of marriage. And in fact, that's part of the theme of the abolition of man that we looked at a few weeks ago, that there is a moral code that is found in all countries, in all cultures, or nearly all, that is wildly similar, that is strikingly consistent.
In this first chapter on the law of human nature, Lewis states, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you'll find the same man going back on this a moment later. Please explain what Lewis means.
Moral relativism, and if you're not familiar with the term, moral relativism just means that there is no universal standard of right and wrong, that morality is up to an individual's decision or it's up to the culture to decide or something like that. But it changes, it shifts. That's the basic idea of relativism, that moral decisions shift and are flexible, where absolutism would hold that certain things are always right and certain things are always wrong. It's always wrong to lie. It's always wrong to murder, and so on. Relativism is very attractive to a lot of people because it's flexible, and we don't want to get boxed in. These circumstances are very different, and so it should let me cheat on my taxes or to sleep with my girlfriend. The problem with relativism is that it is very easy to refute. In fact, it's self-refuting, because as soon as you say something like, well, there is no universal moral standard about morality, well, you've just made a universal statement about the nature of morality. But also, and I think more to what Lewis is talking about here, it's very easy to refute relativism in a practical level, too. Like we were talking earlier about justice. Somebody who says, well, I think that people should be able to follow their own convictions, and if they change from time to time, that's okay. The professor says, okay, well, then I just give you an F on your paper.
Yeah.
Well, that's not fair. Well, as soon as you say, well, that's not fair, you're not a relativist anymore. You're using some kind of absolutist perspective.
Someone that has that opinion, grab their wallet and run.
Exactly.
Because they're not going to be happy with you for taking their wallet. Again, points to the fact that they have a belief that that's wrong for you to do that.
The ideals and the principles of moral absolutism can seem very harsh to a lot of people, that there are some things that are always right. Do you mean I always have to tell the truth? But that is the foundation for how we live and work. We want our property to be respected. We don't want somebody to break into our house or to steal our car. We don't want someone to beat us up or to bully us, or we don't want rape or shootings. These are wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is because those things by nature are wrong.
Not to get too political, but that's what a lot of people are angry about now, is that politicians are doing things that the common person cannot do, right?
Yeah.
And there's a set of rules for them different from everyone else.
And again, the ideals of absolutism is that the same rules apply to all people, to the king and the pauper.
Mm-hmm. We talked about previously that Lewis is called the apostle to the skeptic. So he's really seeking to address a lot of the arguments or in the mind of his listeners and readers. A second potential objection to Lewis's understanding of this natural law that we all have within us, the knowledge of right and wrong, what we ought to do, as you mentioned, is the morality is just a social convention.
Yeah, this is a good question, and this helps to get at the role of God in these sorts of things, which is where Lewis is going. The idea of a social convention is something that we agree upon as humans, something that we agree to do to make society run smoothly in some regards. And usually it's in a kind of a narrow situation. We agree in this circumstance to do this. Like a great example is a speed limit. There's nothing innately right about driving 35 versus, say, 36 or 37. There's not a magic number here that's moral, and you go too fast, it's immoral. We've just decided that based on our cars and the roads and the amount of pedestrian traffic, that these are the safe limits for traveling.
So that's a social convention?
It is. That's a social convention. Or the idea that you can go on a green light and you have to stop on a red light. There's nothing innately about the green light that makes you go. It's just that that's what we've decided. You go on green and you stop on red. We could talk about all kinds of social conventions, things like the taxes that we pay or how long a baseball game should be, and you have a national holiday and a day off. All of these are conventions. So we have those. Those are true, but that doesn't explain all of morality. Mm-hmm. The natural law, Lewis would say, is mind independent. That means it's not based on our own thoughts or agreements, but it exists, whether it's been discovered or not. So it exists on its own. It's part of the way things are. It's a fact of the world. And it's a fact of the world because Lewis, as a theist, believes that God wrote it into the way the world is. So that when we think about the nature of reality and think about what God has revealed to us, we realize that it's right to be fair. It's right to tell the truth. It's right to honor other people's lives. It's right to do that. And it's not because I just came up with it, or because a group of people got together and wrote a constitution or legislated some laws. But no, it's right because that's the way things are. It's a fact about the world.
And all of that points us to a God.
Absolutely.
Behind it.
This is the moral argument that Lewis makes for the existence of God. This is really where Book 1 of Mere Christianity is going. Lewis takes his time to get there. He wants to try to establish very clearly this natural law, this law of human nature that is mind independent. It's part of the way the world is. And if he's right, then the natural question arises, well, how did it get there? Where did it come from? And the only real answer to that question is that God made it. God, who is moral, gave us this law when he made the world.
Well, in chapter 5 of book 1, or this first section that we've been discussing, and we're spending a good amount of time in this section because it is so important to Lewis's arguments and thinking and very applicable to us today. Lewis argues that there are two lines of evidence that support the idea that there is somebody or something behind everything. What are those two lines of argument?
The two lines of evidence are the universe that God has made, and then the point that we were just talking about, and that is that he interacts with our internal selves, with our spirit, with our soul. God, as the creator of the world, has left in the world he made evidence. There's things that we can see. But he also, because of the nature of morality and because we have a conscience, we have these deep feelings within us, and recognizing that internal instinct, that internal feeling within us is a pointer towards a larger reality. These internal instincts and feelings are pointers to a broader reality that's God. Mm-hmm. Lewis thinks this is actually the best way for us to reason our way to God, these internal sorts of things, that God works through our conscience, that God has given us a number of instincts which point in the direction of God. God has given us desires, and these desires are only fulfilled by God. And in these ways, believes that God is speaking to us, drawing us.
So everybody born into this world has these two lines of evidence. Lewis would argue, looking at the world around us and creation, and then the conscience or the moral law, the natural law within us.
Yeah, I think so. This internal way of thinking is not unlike what John Calvin calls the sensus divinitatis. We all have within us a sense, even a conviction that there is a God. Now, some rebel against that and try to push that away, but we all have that naturally within us.
You've mentioned a couple times now, the previous podcast, that Lewis didn't use a lot of scripture references, but this sounds a lot like Romans 1 and 2, doesn't it?
It sure does, yeah. I think it's very interesting. The first evidence, which was the universe that he made, reflects what Paul teaches in Romans 1. And he says that the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen in what has been made. And I love to point out to my students the kind of irony here. Paul says, these invisible things are clearly seen, clearly perceived, right? We don't usually say that invisible things are clearly seen, but with a little reason, we can know that God exists. The beauty of the world, the intricacy of the world, the way the world operates are all pointers to God's power, his providence, and his love. But then in Romans 2, Paul very clearly points to the idea of a natural law. He talks about the Gentiles who don't have the Mosaic law, nevertheless do the things of the law. And of course, we all know that reading Romans, you have to be very careful to how Paul uses words. And one of the words that he uses in a couple different ways is the word law. And it's if we looked at that verse very carefully, it's Romans 2:15 and 16. It says the Gentiles don't have the Mosaic law, but they do have the law. And I think he means the natural law.
Right.
Written on their hearts, as Jeremiah says, that they can know and have access to. And they know they shouldn't lie, they shouldn't murder, and so on.
Paul says we're all without excuse, Romans 1 and 2. The Gentiles without excuse because they have creation around them, pointing to Creator, the moral law within them or conscience to point to a God. And the Jewish people also have that special revelation in the Mosaic law. I would argue that's still two of the strongest arguments for the existence of God today, right?
Absolutely.
And apologists use it regularly.
Absolutely. You know, the universe around us leads to the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and then Lewis's notion of the moral law within our minds. Well, that's the moral argument. And those are three of the most famous philosophical arguments for God. Cosmological argument, there are things in the world that demand an explanation. And the best explanation is that God is the one that caused them, that he made them. And then there's the teleological argument, the argument from design. The world is so well made. The world is so beautiful, so intricate, so complex. It couldn't just have happened. It had to have an intelligent designer. Those are the first part, the universe. And then the moral argument reflects the things that are within us.
A couple weeks ago, we spoke of Anthony Flew believed in God, and Romans 1 and 2 says it's enough. Creation and conscience is enough to condemn us, but not enough to save us. We still need the message of Christ.
Right. I don't think those things are enough to save us, but I think that they are sufficient for us to see that there is a God. In addition to seeing that there is a God, also sufficient for us to know that there is a right and wrong, and also to know that we don't always follow that. We can know that we are sinners. We can know that there is a moral component, and there is a God. What we need is the gospel of Jesus, and that comes to us through the scriptures.
Yeah. Dr. Yoder, Lewis has a great quote that I would like you to elaborate upon. He writes, God is the only comfort. He's also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He's our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies.
It is a great quote. One of the things that Lewis is very good at is helping us to think about God and get past this notion that God is just our friend, just our buddy, that God only wants to give us things and never expect anything from us. It immediately makes me think of his portrayal of Aslan in the Narnia Chronicles. Aslan, of course, is the picture of Christ. Throughout the books, they say, you need to remember, Aslan is very good, but he's not a tame lion. And I think that's an excellent way of kind of refocusing our notions. God is good. God is all good, and he's loving, and he does, at the end, want the best for us. But he's not a tame God. He's not a God we can just put in a box. He's not a God that we can contain. God is higher than us, and God is a God of eternal knowledge and power, and he is a God of justice, and that means that he's going to punish those that are wicked. He is a God of mercy, but he's a God that grows angry. and he has high expectations. Everything in the scriptures tells us that God is not going to compromise on his ideals. We know that there are going to be those that are going to be shocked at the day of judgment, that they have not measured up, that they have not done what God expected them to do. And so that's what I think Lewis is getting at.
Well, that's a great way to close. If you're listening today, you've been exposed to the fact that God has created us in a way that we can know him through creation around us, through the conscience within us. But you need to recognize that God, in his mercy and grace, sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to enter into the world, to make peace, to restore our relationship with God the Father that we've offended. Can accept Jesus Christ as the payment for your sin today. That would be wonderful. We are going to have to conclude today's podcast, but we will continue a discussion of one of Lewis's most influential books next week, Mere Christianity, and I hope you'll join us again. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
Devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.